Hi friends, I'm Sarah Jo Strawberry, and today I just want to talk about Hogwarts Legacy. Not only do I want to talk about Hogwarts Legacy, I want to talk about one character in particular. So wands at the ready as we dive in.
We leave our legacy in your hands.
Hogwarts Legacy is rife with fascinating, fleshed-out characters that players have come to love. From fellow students to residents of the magical hamlets around you, there's a lot to be uncovered about their backstories, or revelioed, if you will, which, if you're like me, you will a lot.
Revelio.
Now, I don't want to talk about the game or the characters in general. There's one particular character, a professor, who I want to discuss today. It would seem that they have a lot of personal details and secrets hidden in plain sight that you may have missed. I know I did for a while. Some of these I only discovered recently, and this is after about 6 months of obsessively taking notes. I have a notebook with over 50 pages of handwritten notes about this one character. And it would seem that they were meant to do a lot more in the game than they did. They're one of the 5 professors who arrives to assist you and Professor Fig in the battle against Ranrock and his loyalists at Keeper's Caverns. And they're the only one to actually be on the battlefield alongside the two of you. Who is this professor? Can you read it? I should probably take this hat off. Okay, back in business. That's right. Yes, it is Professor Aesop Sharp. Okay. Let me just have some water. So here is my notebook I mentioned with over 50 pages of handwritten notes, specifically about Professor Sharp. I truly became obsessive while trying to answer these questions for myself. Basically spending every day very much like this.
The horror of my every waking moment, the nefarious Professor
Sharp.
During my first playthrough of Hogwarts Legacy, I got the sense early on that Professor Sharp was meant to play a bigger role in the story of the game. I was expecting him to do more later on, and not that he doesn't, but I was just expecting more than what we got, and to be honest, was a bit disappointed. But I'll go into that a bit more later on as we discuss the timeline of the game and the part that Sharp plays in it. For now, let's start by discussing who is Professor Sharp. Professor Aesop Sharp was the potions master at Hogwarts during the 1890 to 1891 school year, and for at least a few years prior.
You say that every year, Matilda.
He's a member of Slytherin House. That's right, I own 2 shirts. And a former Auror who left the ministry after sustaining an injury on the job. I wasn't sure where else in the video to bring this up, so I guess at the top, let's address the elephant in the room. There are some professors in Hogwarts Legacy who had big boots to fill, who understandably would be compared to their beloved original Harry Potter counterparts. In my opinion, the 4 professors who people love the most, appreciate the most, would want to see their equivalent of here are Dumbledore, of course, Professor McGonagall, Hagrid, and this guy.
Severus Snape.
Going into the game, players are arguably going to be looking for these parallels, and as I'm sort of discussing first impressions of Sharp's character here, it makes sense to discuss his counterpart, Severus Snape. Aside from holding the same position at Hogwarts and both being members of Slytherin House, they have somewhat similar appearances and similar high expectations of their students, though one is definitely more fair than the other, to say the least.
It can heal some injuries, but not all. Points for Ravenclaw.
Look, we've just got to grit our teeth and do it. Tonight when we get back to the common room, we'll both have partners. Agreed? Agreed.
We'll discuss a bit more about Snape and some other Wizarding World characters as we go on, but let's break down the timeline of Hogwarts Legacy, specifically the moments where we see Sharp. We first see Professor Sharp in the background of the sorting ceremony, where he appears to be acting very NPC-ish and fidgety. Or, as I put in my multitude of notes, he seems a bit drunk. I wrote this as a joke, but I think there actually may be more to that thought, but hold on to that for now, we're gonna get back to it later. He's first mentioned during our common room conversations before our first day of class, at least if you're a Gryffindor or a Ravenclaw. He's mentioned by Gareth Weasley, Cressida Bloom, and Samantha Dale. The next time we see Sharp is the first time we fully see him and actually hear him. This is in Professor Fig's office after our visit to the restricted section with Sebastian Sallow. I just need to say that is the first time I've said that without tripping up, because you might not realize, but restricted, restricted, you know what? I'm just gonna shut up and be happy I got it right on the first try, and we're gonna move on.
Try saying that 5 times faster.
Now, to dance is to let the body...
We walk in on a conversation between Sharp and Fig, where Fig appears to be telling Sharp about what actually happened to you at Gringotts, and giving him more details about the Goblin Rebellion.
You cannot be serious. Goblins working with Rookwood? Makes no sense.
Next, he's mentioned in our first herbology class by Professor Garlick. She actually mentions him twice, once while addressing the class, and almost immediately after while talking to just you. She tells you that Dittany is used in Wiggenweld potion, but she'll leave it to Professor Sharp to tell you more. And now we get to the part where we are fully, properly introduced to Professor Sharp, our first potions class.
Potions is one of the most challenging and hazardous subjects taught at this school. As 5th years, you will be required to reach new heights of both discipline and intellect.
This is where we first learn that Professor Sharp is an Auror, unless you went to his classroom before your first class and did the Revelio page on his Auror badge. In class, he has you brew a Wiggenweld and then an Edurus potion. Meanwhile, Gareth Weasley tries to convince you to steal a Fooper feather from his office, and this is one of the few times in the game where your choices actually affect the dialogue more, and depending on if you do or don't help Gareth, Professor Sharp responds differently, but then ultimately kind of comes to the same conclusion.
As for the work you did today at your own cauldron, I will say you've done well.
Following the main quest, Jackdaw's Rest, and your discovery of the map chamber, you receive an owl post from Professor Sharp with your first potions assignments, after which you will learn the spell Depulso. You complete your assignments and head to the potions classroom where you take your second potions class, after which you learn the spell. Once you've learned Depulso, a little while later you'll receive a second owl post from Professor Sharp that you need to learn Diffindo. Complete this next round of assignments, and then head to his classroom to learn another new spell. The next time we see Professor Sharp is during the Caretaker's Lunar Lament quest. He's one of the 4 professors we have to sneak past as we make our way up the faculty tower. We find him on the landing outside of his chambers talking to Professor Weasley. They're discussing their students' progress so far this school year, and with his full cynicism on display, we see that Professor Sharp is thoroughly unimpressed.
How are your students getting along this year?
Rather poorly, I'd say.
Actually, this is one of the moments where we get one of my favorite Sharp lines, and we'll see some more of this in a little bit, but I just want to take a moment of appreciation for the line.
We're raising a generation of coddled cape flappers that can scarcely tell the difference between aconite and asphodel.
After the caretaker's lunar lament, we don't see Sharp for a bit until the Polyjuice plot. He's one of the 3 professors we encounter while in disguise as Professor Black, and is the first of these professors. He's approaching Professor Black to let him know about a cure for boils he's brewed for him, and tries to be subtle about it, but since it's not actually Professor Black, we're gonna mess with him a bit, because, you know, screw him, he canceled the Quidditch season. Next, we see him in the battle against Ranrock, as I mentioned at the beginning. He's one of the 5 professors who arrives to assist you and Professor Sharp, and the only one who is actually fighting alongside you and Professor Fig.
Now, Professor Fig, aren't you going to leave some for the rest of us?
We couldn't be happier to see you, Professor Fig.
And I remember when this happened, I thought it was so cool. I was also expecting the other professors to pop in and kind of take turns, but I guess if any of them were going to do it, Sharp does make the most sense. In his excitement during the battle, he does almost inadvertently kill us, but thankfully we are saved by Professor Weasley. Following the battle, we see him in the background of the Great Hall during Professor Fig's funeral scene, and once we've completed our OWLs and attend the House Cup ceremony, we see him yet again in the background of the Great Hall. As I mentioned with the sorting ceremony, during these moments he is very fidgety, wobbly, NPC-ish, perhaps drunk. I don't know. Finally, if you go to the potions classroom after the story of the main game is over, he'll pass along his condolences about Professor Fig to you and thank you for your part in saving the school.
Who knows what would have happened to the school had it not been for you? We owe you our gratitude. All of us.
The main timeline that we just looked at is just an overview of what you would learn about Professor Sharp if you're only playing the main story of the game and just trying to get through to the end and not really side questing. Just the surface level information. However, there's a lot that the game both shows and tells us about Sharp through other means. Let's begin this deeper dive by looking into what I like to call the timeline of potential. These are the moments of things being told by the story writers about Sharp. First, let's go back to that encounter with Sharp in Professor Fig's office. Fig is adamant that you tell no one about what actually happened to the 2 of you on your way to Hogwarts. However, he's fairly quick to tell Professor Sharp. In fact, unless you've told Natty or Sebastian at this point, by the time of your first potions class, he is the only other person who knows what happened to you and Fig. I also find it just funny that before he leaves Fig's office, he pauses for a moment to kind of look you over and just goes, and walks away.
I'll see what I can find out.
As I've said before, I went through this game the first time expecting something more to happen with Professor Sharp, and on my second playthrough, I started trying to pick up on things early on that might have pointed to this, to understand why I got this thought, because I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I've realized that it almost seems the other characters in the game and just other things in the game are telling you that you need to pay particular attention to this character. Starting with the common room conversations, of 11 total professors, not including Headmaster Black, there are 7 who are discussed during these conversations. Of the 7, the one who's mentioned the most is Professor Fig, mentioned 5 times, which is understandable considering the circumstances of your arrival. And the next most mentioned professor is Professor Sharp, who is mentioned 3 times, as I said earlier, by Gareth, Cressida, and Samantha. The next time Professor Sharp is mentioned, or the first time he's mentioned if you're playing as a Hufflepuff or a Slytherin, is during your conversation with Professor Weasley after your first classes. If you ask her more about J. Pippin's potions, she mentions that they rarely sell recipes, but Professor Sharp asked that they have some on hand just for you. This is very interesting because, as we learn, it's not at all rare for J. Pippins to sell recipes. It seems that they have a healthy stock of them when we arrive, and even J. Pippins casually mentions that, yeah, they sell recipes, like it's an item they commonly have in stock. So, what was the point of saying that Sharp went out of his way to have them stock these for you if that's not the case? His third mention, and again, this is all prior to your first potions class, is during herbology class, as I mentioned before, when Professor Garlick mentions Sharp teaching you more about Wiggenweld potion. Interestingly, where the other professors will say, Professor so-and-so's class, we never hear that from Sharp. He simply says, pay attention in herbology, not pay attention in Professor Garlick's class. So just thought that was some interesting word choice there. Between your various classes, assignments, and questing, you have the opportunity to go back to your professors and have 2 separate side conversations with them. In your first side conversation with Professor Sharp, you learn a bit more about his time as an Auror and how he sustained his injury while chasing a shrunken head dealer to a harbour in Scarborough, and that his partner died during this. So remember how I said earlier there were some other Wizarding World characters we were going to discuss who have some parallels to Sharp besides from Severus Snape? Well, there is another character who shares a lot of similarities with Sharp, and that would be another former Auror turned Hogwarts professor, albeit under odd circumstances, Alistair Mad-Eye Moody. Aside from the two going from being Aurors to Hogwarts professors, both sustained injuries to their left side while working as Aurors. There's another non-Wizarding World character that Sharp can be compared to, particularly in his career as an Auror, and that is Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was first introduced to the world in 1887 with the publication of A Study in Scarlet. Interestingly, this is 3 years prior to the setting of the game. I'll get a bit more into the Holmes comparison in a moment, but there's another character that is based on Sherlock Holmes that I think Sharp shares even more parallels to, which is Gregory House, MD. Aside from the two of them walking with a limp, you could also compare Sharp's career as a potioneer to House's career as a doctor. Sharp has to work as a healer in some capacity. As we see, he's making a cure for boils for Professor Black, and as we'll go into a bit more later on, he's also trying to find a cure for himself, so clearly he has some medical expertise.
A cold, unemotional subject. You have attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which has much the same effect as if you'd worked a love story or an elopement into the 5th proposition of Euclid.
Sharp, Holmes, and House could all be described as untidy. At best, described as not keeping up with current standards or trends. Now, the thing about these 3 characters that's interesting to me that brings up some questions is, what was the relationship like between Sharp and his partner? Sherlock Holmes has Dr. Watson, House has Wilson. Surely Sharp and his partner must have been close. If you read the entirety of the Sherlock Holmes canon, you know that Dr. Watson dies long before Holmes does. In House MD, the series leaves off with Wilson dying of cancer and House preparing to run away and change his identity. So, surely this dead partner, a la Watson or Wilson, must have had an impact on Sharp's personal life. At best, we can assume Sharp lives with some intense survivor's guilt. Aside from the physical trauma that Sharp goes through after sustaining his injury, no doubt he is dealing with a lot of mental anguish, feeling guilty that his partner died and he didn't, and that he may have been the one to get them into that situation. During our second side conversation with Sharp, we ask more about his injury, and he tells us that he'd still be an Auror if it weren't for that. They wanted to keep him on, though at a desk job, but he would have been running the Auror recruitment program, which, to me, points to him being an exceptionally talented wizard. Especially considering in order to become an Auror, you already have to be exceptional, so if you're considered so exceptional that, in spite of the fact you cannot physically be an Auror anymore, they still want you there, to me that speaks volumes. We also learned during this conversation that one of the primary reasons he came back to Hogwarts was to access the library to help research in order to find a cure for himself. I know I've already brought this next point up a lot, but I think it's very key to mention again when we're discussing the tells the game gives us about Professor Sharp, and that's the battle against Ranrock. Again, we see from him being on the battlefield alongside us that he has missed the thrill of battle that he had when he was an Auror, and he tells us as much during one of those side conversations. And again, his enthusiasm is so great that he nearly kills us. The final tell about Sharp comes from eavesdropping on our fellow students. Of 32 comments about Sharp, at least that I've been able to count, only 35% of them are positive or neutral, meaning he has a 65% unfavorability rating among students if we measure that by these comments. However, there are some students who seem to really like Professor Sharp, and I cannot blame them.
I'm a marriage butt.
And as we see, there are students like Amit who hold Professor Sharp in high regard and have a lot of respect for him. And now we get to my favorite part, the stuff that really made me want to make this video, which is what the game shows us about Professor Sharp. One of the ways in which we learn more about the characters in the game is through the notes that we find throughout Hogwarts, Hogsmeade, and the Highlands. There are 3 notes in the game that are somehow tied to Professor Sharp. The first of which is the Auror memo that we find in his office during our first potions class. What the Auror memo shows us is an indication of Sharp's age. It's one of the few dated notes that we find in the game, and while we don't know for sure if this is about his first assignment, I think it's safe to assume it is, because why else would he have a 15-year-old memo lying around, if not as a memento of the beginning of his Auror career? It says something in the memo about new recruits, and it's not clear if this is new recruits to this particular assignment or new recruits to the Auror program, but I'm going to assume that this is from the beginning of his Auror career, and the whole reason it's there and dated is so we can guess his age. And from this, it's safe to guess that his age is 36 or 37.
Something like 36?
What? Something like 36?
37.
I'm 37?
Going to class.
I've actually nailed down 3 potential birthdays for Professor Sharp, but we're going to get into that later on. If this memo is in fact about his first or one of his first Auror assignments, then we can surmise that he graduated from Hogwarts in 1872. Aurors have to go through a mandatory 3-year training program before being active Aurors, so 1872 plus 3 years gives us the 1875 start year of Sharp's career as an Auror. So if he graduated from Hogwarts in 1872, that means he would have started at Hogwarts on September 1st, 1865 at 11 years old. This would place his birthday somewhere between September 2nd and December 31st of 1853, or between January 1st and September 1st of 1854. It also makes a lot of sense for Sharp to be around 36 years old, as we're playing a 5th year in the game, and during Harry's 5th year at Hogwarts, Severus Snape was 36 years old. The next note we find that is associated with Professor Sharp is in Professor Hecat's chambers. If you've learned Alohomora 2, then on your way up to the headmaster's office, you can stop in Professor Hecat's chambers, and in her bedroom you find a note from Sharp following up on an in-person conversation about the Goblin Rebellion and what happened to you and Fig at Gringotts. We can infer from this note that long before Professor Fig reached out to Professor Weasley for backup, Professor Sharp was already organizing the other professors behind the scenes, knowing that something big was coming. Aside from this note showing us that Sharp may have been the one to actually organize everything to save you in the end, we also are shown something else very interesting, and that is his name. It would seem that this note is the only time in the game his first name, Aesop, is mentioned. I've heard a recording of one of the NPC students saying his name, and a recording for the portrait Lethia Burbley where she says his name. However, I spent hours following students around and standing by Lethia's portrait, and I never once heard either of these lines. So yeah, this note is where we learn his name. I also think it's kind of sweet that he addresses the letter to Professor Hecat and signs it off simply as Aesop Sharp. It just kind of shows that he has a certain level of respect for Professor Hecat and holds her in a higher regard. And now, what's in a name? The name Aesop has no known meaning, but we can safely assume that he is named for the Greek storyteller and fabulist Aesop, as that is the first known use of the name. Aside from their name, the two share some other characteristics. Aesop was known to have some sort of physical impairment, but also to be sharp-witted, which I think that's where the Sharp part of his name comes from. Sharp tends to use very poetic language when he speaks, a lot of alliteration and interesting word choice.
Proficiency and potions are two things that cannot be rushed. Have patience and be thorough.
I brewed an Edurus potion, as you asked, Professor.
You seemed rather busy helping Mr. Weasley brew chaos. It was not fear, but fate that steered my hand. Fate is what one makes of it. It may determine a path, but not one's choice in how to travel it.
There's also a particular line of Sharps, shortcuts only ever lead to shortcomings, that reminds me a lot of one of Aesop's best-known fables, The Tortoise and the Hare. There is also a Hellenistic statue of Aesop that looks a bit like Professor Sharp, but I'll let you be the judge. We'll take a look at the third note associated with Sharp in a moment, but before that, I want to take a moment to explore the Potion Master's Chambers. After you've collected a total of 22 Demiguise statues, you unlock Alohomora 3, with which you can unlock Sharp's chambers and explore them and learn a whole lot about him. To begin, Sharp's chambers really stand out from the rest of the Professor's chambers. They are considerably bigger than the others. Initially, I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but Sharp has a fireplace in each of his 2 rooms, whereas the other professors only have one, typically in their sitting room. Along with having 2 fireplaces, there's also a secret room hidden behind the fireplace in Sharp's sitting room. So he's definitely got a good amount of space. His chambers appearing massive is not helped by the fact that they're kind of empty. Sure, there's a lot of clutter in there, but it seems to be contained to the most lived-in parts of the room. He has stacks of trunks that it would seem he never unpacked. He only has 2 shirts or jackets hanging up in his wardrobe, some piles of clothes here and there, but otherwise it would just appear that he's still living out of trunks after having been at Hogwarts for quite a few years. Remember earlier when I said that Sharp, Sherlock Holmes, and Gregory House are all fairly untidy? This is where we really see that about Sharp. Earlier, we see that he's scruffy and his collar seems to be a bit crooked, so you don't get the impression he really cares about his appearance, but once you see his rooms, you see that that's definitely the case. Aside from the piles of clothes, the portraits are hung crooked, if they're hung at all. Some have clothing or blankets draped over them. The rugs on the floor are crooked and seem like a tripping hazard. There are bottles and potion vials all over the place, books and parchment scattered about. It's a wonder his bed is made. There's also some wallpaper peeling in his bedroom, and taking a closer look at this is when I finally realized that one of the things Sharp has in his rooms that tells us a bit about him is a wheelchair, parked beside the couch in his bedroom, and there's also a cane a few feet away. I was kind of bothered by the fact that Sharp didn't use any sort of accessibility device because I felt like it was an opportunity for some representation. However, some have theorized that his boots are actually bracers, which does make a lot of sense. But we actually do see here that he does have some accessibility devices that, for one reason or another, he chooses not to use. There are also these devices on the bureau in his sitting room that look like they might be braces. They also kind of look like stirrups. And now we come to the third note we find pertaining to Professor Sharp, which is the J. Pippin's Potions shopping list we find on his desk. On it, he lists some ingredients that he hasn't tried in potion making towards his cure that he wants to talk to Perry Pippin about. I did a bit more research into the ingredients listed here, as some of them are real-world plants or have real-world counterparts. And what's very interesting is that most of these ingredients, their real-world applications include treating cancer. So perhaps he's trying to tackle his injury like a cancer. Also at this desk, if you look closely at the floor, there is blood splattered everywhere. I don't know how it took me so long to notice this, but there's quite a bit, which begs the question, why? My best guess is that he attempted to perform some sort of surgery on himself, and when I brought it up to my husband, that was his first assumption as well. So, going back to what I said about him acting as a healer or doctor in some capacity, comparing him to Gregory House, apparently he's also a surgeon? There's actually one other thing hidden in Sharp's rooms that tells us a lot about his character, potentially. However, we're gonna wait just a little bit longer to talk about that. Now that we've gone through the tell and the show of Professor Sharp, let's talk about what the game hides about Professor Sharp. There's quite a bit in the game files and unused content that gives us a bit more of an idea that he was meant to do more in the game. There's an unused line of his pertaining to your learning Diffindo, where he tells you that he and his partner were once tied up like Christmas hams and left to be fed to the horntails, and that Diffindo came in handy to cut their binds. A couple other unused lines tell us that Sharp's feelings about his students are mutual. He mentions a couple times that he's had his fill of students for the day and just wants to be left alone. Some of the biggest stuff that is hidden about Sharp is within the game files. All credit for this goes to Grand Theft Diamonds on YouTube, who made a whole video about the game files and what other details about the characters are hidden therein. One of the most important details about Professor Sharp we learn from these files is his birthday. Remember how I said earlier there were a range of dates that I was able to calculate being his birthday? Well, in the game files, it actually says that his birthday is on the 1st of a summer month. We don't know the actual month or year, so with the information I discussed earlier, we can now nail his birthday down to being July 1st, August 1st, or September 1st of 1854. The craziest thing that was discovered in the game files is that there are 2 unused character models for Professor Sharp. When I learned this, my mind was blown. I'm pretty sure I screamed in excitement because I was finally seeing that I wasn't crazy, and there has to have been more that this character was meant to do. I actually had evidence towards it. These 2 character models are labeled Aesop Sharp Young and Aesop Sharp Teen. No one knows what the purpose of these character models was, but most assume that there was meant to be a pensive memory where we learned about why Professor Sharp became an Auror. I'm guessing this got taken out of the game because the developers decided they wanted the pensives to be specific to the keepers. Some of the other things we learn from the game files are Professor Sharp's blood status, which is that he's a half-blood. However, his young model is labeled as a pureblood.
Should you chop the kidney or crush it? The wrong answer could result in the unfortunate loss of your eyebrows.
How did you do that?
Crush it, don't cut it.
No, the instructions specifically say to cut.
And also that he is a member of the upper class, though his youth model is tagged as being lower class. I'm not sure why the youth model is different from the teen and adult models, but I'm going to go with the information on the adult models as being accurate, so it would seem that he is a wealthy half-blood. He's also tagged as an infiltrator, and I honestly don't know what that means or what it could mean, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it stood out to me. And now finally, we break down some of my theories I've developed about Sharp's character, what some of his secrets may be, and what his future looks like from everything I've presented to you thus far. The first of these theories is the Anne Sallow theory, which is honestly the simplest theory and one that is not original to me. I know a lot of players have come to this assumption as well, which is that Professor Sharp's affliction is the same as Anne Sallow's. However, It would seem that Anne Sallows is much more serious, as we get the impression she is on the brink of death, whereas Sharp's in a lot of pain, but he's still working and living his life. This makes me think that Sharp's larger part in the story, that clearly was supposed to be in the final game, had something to do with Sebastian Sallow searching for a cure for Anne, and somehow this pensive memory with Sharp, somehow helping Sharp with his injury, became part of helping find a cure for Anne. My next theory is the alchemy theory, that Professor Sharp is the alchemy professor and is using alchemy towards his cure. In the dungeons down the hall from the sleeping dragon statue, if you've learned Alohomora 2, you can unlock the alchemy classroom. When you do the Revelio page in there, you learn alchemy class is an arcane subject offered to older students on the rare occasion demand suffices. Alchemy focuses on the 4 natural elements in the science of transmutation. Of the 11 professors at the school, none are introduced to us as the alchemy professor, so it would stand to reason that the potions master would also serve in this position, as why would they hire someone to be the alchemy professor if alchemy is only taught occasionally? Additionally, the alchemy classroom looks a bit like a second potions classroom. Alchemy is also taught as part of 6th year potions class and is included in the textbook Advanced Potion Making. Most people know alchemy and the goal of alchemists to be trying to transform other metals into silver or gold. However, alchemists also are searching for a panacea, or the elixir of life, to help extend their lifespans and... I don't know, why would you want to live that long?
My whole life is a dark room. One big, dark room.
So perhaps Professor Sharp is using alchemy to extend his life a bit so he can find a cure and live the life he wants to. My third theory is arguably my strangest. Throughout this video, I've listed off other characters, both in and out of the wizarding world, that I believe the writers of the game used as inspiration for Professor Sharp. In my personal notes, I referred to these as inspiration theories, and this final inspiration theory is just gonna seem really odd, but I promise it actually makes a bit of sense. I believe that one of the characters Professor Sharp is potentially based on is Claude Frollo.
Witchcraft.
Most people, when they hear the name Claude Frollo, are probably envisioning Disney's Judge Claude Frollo. However, that and many other interpretations of this character are really inaccurate. The actual character of Claude Frollo is fascinating, in my opinion. At the most basic comparison, Sharp, if my calculations are correct, and Frollo are both 36 years old. Yes, if you didn't know, Claude Frollo is meant to be 36 in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. A more general connection between Frollo and the wizarding world, and one that I've previously made long before Hogwarts Legacy was made, is that the people of Paris, including Frollo's own brother, Jehan Frollo, believe he's a sorcerer. Claude Frollo is a self-taught student of alchemy and astrology, with a particular interest in Nicholas Flamel, friend of Albus Dumbledore, and the Philosopher's Stone. Remember a moment ago how I said I think he's using alchemy towards his cure? Claude Frollo's obsessive nature, in terms of his metaphysical pursuits, is very similar to Sharp's obsession with finding a cure for his injury. Also, the description of the cell in which Claude Frollo studies is a very similar description to that of the potions classroom and the alchemy classroom. Victor Hugo's description of this room is inspired by Rembrandt's etching known as Dr. Fautreus, or The Alchemist at Home in His Study. There are details in the etching that Victor Hugo doesn't describe in the book, but are interestingly included in the aforementioned game locations, specifically the stacked cauldrons. This all may not be enough to really argue that Sharp is partially based on Claude Frollo, but I thought the similarities were kind of interesting. And now we come to my fourth theory, which is the one I've been building up to throughout this video. Remember at the beginning when I said this? He seems a bit drunk. I wrote this as a joke, but I think there actually may be more to that thought, but hold on to that for now. We're gonna get back to it later. And a few moments ago, when I said that we'd be going back to the Potion Master's chambers to take a look at one other thing I didn't mention before, well, here we are. And this theory, it's not a fun one, but it is that Professor Sharp suffers from a substance use issue, specifically alcoholism. To begin my argument for this theory, we need to discuss the precedent set by the original Harry Potter books. In the original books, there are two characters who are alcoholics or indicated to be alcoholics, and those would be Winky the house elf, who has an addiction to butterbeer, and Professor Sybil Trelawney. For both Winky and Professor Trelawney, it would seem that their alcoholism stems from emotional trauma. For Winky, it was the trauma of seeing what happened to the family she worked for, the Crouches, and how they were horrifically torn asunder. And for Professor Trelawney, it was likely her feelings of inadequacy in her own powers, especially because she was often compared to one of her ancestors who was a very powerful witch named Cassandra Trelawney. So despite being a game based on a children's family-friendly franchise, addiction issues are not foreign to the Harry Potter universe. It's also not unreasonable that in his pursuit for a cure, he would develop some sort of addiction. If he's trying all these different potions, surely some are similar to drugs. But additionally, his alcoholism may be trying to mask the emotional and physical pain he experiences. Like I said before, he probably has some sort of survivor's guilt, and he's clearly in physical pain. Sharp being an alcoholic would also further the comparisons to Sherlock Holmes and Gregory House. Sherlock Holmes is known to have a cocaine addiction to help with boredom when he's between cases, and likely some other emotional trauma that we aren't fully aware of. And Gregory House is addicted to Vicodin to help with the pain from his leg injury. So everything I've mentioned so far is just circumstantial evidence, me assuming that he's going to use something to fight off the pain, and that's why he looked weird in the background of the sorting ceremony. Sarah, surely that was just a glitch or just some issue with the animation. However, I also want to point out that none of the other professors are as fidgety as Professor Sharp. Anyway, I almost didn't bring this up in this video. I was going to write it out completely simply because I had no real evidence. Until photo mode was introduced to Hogwarts Legacy. In preparation for making this video, I was taking all sorts of capture, but also decided to use photo mode to start zooming in on details of the potions classroom, Professor Sharp's office, his chambers, and I am so glad I waited 6 months to make this video, because photo mode was a game changer. No pun intended. So while taking capture of Professor Sharp's sitting room, I noticed that on the bureau on the far wall, there is a bottle of whiskey sitting out on the ledge of the bureau. And of course, one bottle of whiskey does not an alcoholic make. Perhaps he just wants to have a couple sips at the end of the day just to unwind. Again, maybe help with his pain. But then I looked up and there is another whiskey bottle on top of the bureau. Again, 2 bottles of whiskey does not an alcoholic make. But it's kind of odd that he had it hidden out of sight. Like he was trying to hide something. And then when you go into his bedroom and take a closer look at his desk, you notice that there are 4 bottles that have the same neck of those 2 whiskey bottles sticking out of the drawers on his desk. Additionally, there are 2 bottles of butterbeer in these drawers. There are also a few bottles that kind of look like jugs of moonshine or homemade wine, not unlike Carlo Rossi bottles. There's one by the chair in his sitting room, in reach, so perhaps at the end of the day, when he slinks down into his chair, he can just reach down and take a swig. There are also a couple of these jugs at his desk. I spent a lot of time going around the game, looking at these different bottles for comparison, and you could argue that this is just an unlabeled potions bottle, or perhaps it's even water. However, there are these red containers, these red jugs that I think are actually water containers. The only other places in the game where you find these jugs are in said bars and watering holes and pubs. However, there are more places where you find those red jugs, which is why I think those may actually be water jugs. I also looked in the potions closet and J. Pippin's potions and the hospital wing at the different potions stored there, and you cannot find these moonshine jugs in those locations. So I don't have solid evidence of those containing alcohol, but I personally just firmly believe that's what they are. And regardless of if they are or aren't, why are there 6 bottles of whiskey? And now, my final theory, which is a series of theories. Sharp's future. Assuming Sharp doesn't find a cure for his injury within the 2 years following the story of the game, and stays on at Hogwarts, he would have been Albus Dumbledore's first potions professor, as Dumbledore started at Hogwarts in 1894. And if he continued to not find a cure, then he would have been Dumbledore's potions professor throughout the entirety of his time as a student at Hogwarts. And if that's the case, that would also mean that he was likely Horace Slughorn's first, and for the entirety of his education, potions professor. In The Half-Blood Prince, Molly Weasley says of Horace Slughorn, "He was at Hogwarts for ages, started around the same time as Dumbledore, I think." The implications of Sharp being Horace Slughorn's potions professor are really interesting to me, as this gives us a direct through line of Sharp to Snape. Aesop Sharp taught Horace Slughorn basically everything he knows about potions that he went on to teach to students, one of whom was Severus Snape, who went on to himself become the potions master. Also, I meant to bring this up earlier, but regarding the parallels between Sharp and Snape, there's one thing that I find kind of funny, which is that Sharp, due to his background as an Auror, would be better suited to teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts. However, he is content to be teaching potions, as he has a knack for it, which is the total opposite of Snape, who was the potions master, but really, really wanted to be the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher.
You applied first for the Defense Against the Dark Arts post, is that correct?
Yes.
But you were unsuccessful?
Obviously.
Professor Sharp may also, at some point, have had a family of his own, or at least had some relatives out there. Much like Weasley, Gaunt, etc., Sharp is a family name used in Hogwarts Legacy that is borrowed from the original Harry Potter series and elsewhere in the Wizarding World universe. In the film Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1, Kitty Sharp and Scarlet Sharp are 2 missing witches listed on the Potter Watch radio program. To leave off this discussion of Sharp's future, and to end the theories segment, I want to pose a question to you, because I don't have an answer for this myself. There isn't really a clear answer that could be found. This is basically a matter of opinion. So my question is, if Sharp were to find a cure for his injury, what do you think he would do? Would he go back to being an Auror, or at this point has so much time passed that it wouldn't make sense to do that and he would just stay on at Hogwarts, or would he go on to do something else? So, in spite of my dozens of pages of notes on this, the one thing I never wrote were any closing thoughts, so I don't really know how to wrap up this video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you've made it this far. Thank you for sticking through my crazy fangirl ramblings. Let me know what you think about these theories. Is there something about Professor Sharp that I missed? I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. And I guess I'll leave you with this collection of glitches and other funny things I encountered while capturing video for this video. Bye!
Say, would you like a chocolate-covered pretzel?
Go back to your dorm and change into your school robes immediately. You misplace your robes. Unorthodox. It's inconceivable.
Inconceivable! I know, Your Majesty, not the eternal stench.
Run along then. Class is dismissed.
Alright. I think I managed to get through that without simping too hard. Damn it!